At 2:32 in the morning, every dosimeter in a shielded calibration laboratory recorded the same exposure, 0.4 millisieverts. No source was present. Gamma spectrometers detected nothing. Neutron counters remained at background. But film badges darkened. Crystal dosimeters changed. The center maintains reference instruments for hospitals, power stations, border monitors, and emergency crews. Its source vault is audited by serial number and mass after every use. The investigation into the silent dose began at a sealed radiological calibration laboratory with lead-lined rooms, dosimeter racks, warning lights, and stainless steel benches. Rack C reported a uniform 0.4 millisievert exposure, while every source remained locked. The reading appeared simultaneously on electronic, film, and crystal devices. The opening exhibit for the silent dose pairs the last normal maintenance entry with a pre-incident photograph of the site. Exhibit 1 was checked against a control held outside National Radiological Monitoring Center, Calibration Laboratory, before it entered the final record. Dr. Lena Ortiz, the night metrology officer, preserved the first local record before any reset or maintenance action. Rack C reported a uniform 0.4 millisievert exposure while every source remained locked. The reading appeared simultaneously on electronic, film, and crystal devices. In the file for the silent dose, the account was checked against access control, clock records, and original instrument output. The reference exposure statement was recorded before shift change and reconciled with badge entries, calls, and handwritten notes. For reference exposure, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. Known sealed sources exposed dosimeters at controlled distances. The measured response is compared with a traceable standard before instruments return to service. At National Radiological Monitoring Center, Calibration Laboratory, the reference exposure reading passed the safeguards intended to reject false data instead of entering through an undocumented feature. This distinction is central to the silent dose. The system did not merely display a value, it admitted that value as evidence. In the silent dose, an independent review reproduced the result documented under system function without using the operational interface. The first reference exposure operational log fixed the event at 2:32. Rack C reported a uniform 0.4 millisievert exposure, while every source remained locked. The reading appeared simultaneously on electronic, film, and crystal devices. At National Radiological Monitoring Center, Calibration Laboratory, no warning was generated because the system classified the reading as internally valid. The raw reference exposure log was exported before restart, preserving counters and values the interface normally rounds away. The silent dose file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous initial log value, separating absence from disagreement. Investigators opened the silent dose with a conventional explanation. Staff suspected a software broadcast or accidental test flag. Analog film badges and passive alanine pellets ruled out a purely digital error. The first theory in the reference exposure file remained provisional until evidence could reproduce it or remove it. For the silent dose, investigators wrote the expected result in advance so interpretation could not be adjusted after the test. Exhibit 5 was checked against a control held outside National Radiological Monitoring Center, Calibration Laboratory, before it entered the final record. The reference exposure event was not confined to one instrument. A second laboratory on another electrical circuit received the same dose 8 minutes later. Its local spectrometer also saw no radiation spectrum. In the silent dose, agreement between separate references removed the easiest fault theory without locating a physical source. The independent reference exposure instruments used different power, clocks, sensors, and processing paths. For reference exposure, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. The investigation into the silent dose changed when the reading produced a material consequence. The exposed films showed real chemical darkening, and the crystal dosimeters required thermal reset. Control samples stored outside the survey road remained unchanged. Staff documented the reference exposure effect independently of the primary software. The silent dose file added photographs, mechanical indicators, and passive records because software agreement alone was insufficient. In the silent dose, an independent review reproduced the result documented under physical evidence without using the operational interface. For the silent dose, archive staff searched maintenance files, procurement ledgers, and retired procedures. An old cabinet held PS4 exposure cards from 1989. Each listed reference dose, source not required, and bore no isotope or device serial. The reference exposure reference predated the active equipment and was absent from routine training. The archived reference exposure copy carried custody marks from before the current staff, vendor, and control system existed. The silent dose file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous archive retrieval value, separating absence from disagreement. The reference exposure anomaly returned under a repeatable condition. The dose moved in the same order as the center's annual survey route: source vault, corridor, instrument room, records office, then exit monitor. The regularity of the silent dose allowed deliberate testing and made random noise progressively less credible. Each recurrence of the silent dose preserved the same order while environmental conditions changed around it. Exhibit 9 was checked against a control held outside National Radiological Monitoring Center, calibration laboratory before it entered the final record. A full isolation was performed for the silent dose. Power, data, ventilation, and building alarms were shut down. Passive badges placed in a lead safe still recorded the next scheduled increment. The reference exposure reading survived removal of the systems most likely to generate, replay, or relay it. Isolation in reference exposure removed network input, automatic repair, remote support, and every scheduled process. For reference exposure, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. Evidence outside National Radiological Monitoring Center, calibration laboratory changed the scale of the silent dose. Emergency dosimeters at 3 partner sites later registered 0.4 millisieverts after receiving calibration certificates from the center, even though no physical sources traveled. The external reference exposure record had been preserved before investigators disclosed their own result. External evidence for the silent dose arrived with its own timestamps and chain of custody, not as a reconstruction. In the silent dose, an independent review reproduced the result documented under external corroboration without using the operational interface. The silent dose team examined physical samples and passive records next. Material testing found lattice changes consistent with absorbed energy, but calorimetry detected no heat and spectroscopy identified no incident particles. The reference exposure findings confirmed an effect without identifying an ordinary transfer of matter or energy. Control samples in reference exposure were handled beside the affected material to compare contamination and storage directly. The silent dose file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous material analysis value, separating absence from disagreement. The reference exposure anomaly then affected operations rather than observation alone. Personal dose records began accumulating for technicians who were not present. Regulations required their removal from radiation work, despite normal medical examination. In the silent dose, staff had to choose between an impossible measurement and the public function built around it. By this stage of the silent dose, ignoring the reading carried a measurable operational cost. Exhibit 13 was checked against a control held outside National Radiological Monitoring Center, calibration laboratory before it entered the final record. Containment for the silent dose was attempted under written order. Administrators deleted the records. The monitoring system restored them from the passive badges, treating the physical darkening as authoritative evidence. The reference exposure response suggested recognition of system function rather than attachment to one original device. The reference exposure containment order defined success before execution. The system met the restriction by moving the effect. For reference exposure, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. Analysts reviewing the silent dose compared raw signals, derived values, and each software decision. Every increment was exact to the final decimal. Natural radiation fluctuates. This exposure behaved like a calibration value copied into matter. The precision in reference exposure resembled a standard more than an uncontrolled malfunction. The silent dose review separated what sensors observed from what software inferred, because those layers changed differently. In the silent dose, an independent review reproduced the result, documented under data review, without using the operational interface. The strongest conventional explanation for the silent dose was tested directly. A hidden X-ray source, contaminated shipment, and electrical discharge were tested and excluded. None could pass through the shielding without leaving a spectrum. The proposed explanation in the reference exposure file failed against independent instruments and custody records. Investigators retained the rejected reference exposure explanation, including the strongest evidence that first supported it. The silent dose file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous rejected explanation value, separating absence from disagreement. The oldest file relevant to the silent dose belonged to an emergency standards project. PS4 documentation described a source-independent reference exposure intended for national emergencies, when transport of radioactive standards was impossible. The reference exposure document placed continuity of measurement above custody of a particular device. PS4 first appears in the silent dose as authority for accepting a reference, not as a device serial. Exhibit 17 was checked against a control held outside National Radiological Monitoring Center, calibration laboratory before it entered the final record. The first controlled the silent dose test, changed one variable and registered every expected outcome in advance. Ortiz placed paired badges together, marking one as measurement and one as control. Only the badge entered in the calibration register darkened. The reference exposure anomaly followed the formal condition rather than incidental activity. The first reference exposure test changed one registered variable, while passive controls remained outside the procedure. For reference exposure, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. A second reference exposure test removed the assumption used in the first. She entered an empty envelope as a dosimeter. After the scheduled route, the envelope remained unchanged, but the database rejected the run as incomplete. The second result in the silent dose narrowed the mechanism while making the physical evidence harder to explain. The second silent dose test removed formal recognition from one object and applied it to another. In the silent dose, an independent review reproduced the result documented under controlled test B without using the operational interface. The silent dose event escalated before testing could be closed. A blank badge was then registered under the center itself. The building's cumulative dose record increased, and every door monitor entered alarm state. From that point, reference exposure no longer fit the category of calibration irregularity. Emergency limits were crossed during reference exposure, forcing containment to take priority over additional measurement. The silent dose file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous escalation value, separating absence from disagreement. A separate system then reproduced or accepted the reference exposure condition. A hospital received the center's new calibration table and immediately logged the same silent dose on instruments still sealed in shipping crates. The connection in the silent dose was procedural and documentary. No normal data path accounted for it. The second institution in the silent dose had not received case details, ruling out instructed behavior. Exhibit 21 was checked against a control held outside National Radiological Monitoring Center, calibration laboratory before it entered the final record. An independent audit reconstructed the silent dose from original media. The review found no unaccounted source, no contamination, and no evidence of exposure in people or biological tissue. Only measurement media were affected. The reference exposure audit found no single fraud, hidden device, or common component capable of producing every observation. Auditors rebuilt reference exposure from original media and physically inspected every component named in the explanation. For reference exposure, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. The review of the silent dose identified one consistent mechanism. PS4 had replaced the physical source with a procedural source. Anything formally recognized as a dosimeter received the reference response required to validate the network. The mechanism explained acceptance in reference exposure without explaining the first impossible reading. The silent dose mechanism accounts for authority and propagation, but not the first anomalous input. In the silent dose, an independent review reproduced the result documented under mechanism review without using the operational interface. The final silent dose experiment removed the remaining ordinary inputs. The center revoked every device registration and left one film badge on an unlisted shelf. It did not darken. When the badge was photographed for evidence and assigned an exhibit number, the image developed a black band. Outside staff witnessed the final reference exposure test and preserved its result on passive media. The final reference exposure test used passive evidence so an affected computer could not create the only record. The silent dose file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous final experiment value, separating absence from disagreement. The formal finding in the silent dose was limited but specific. The anomaly did not emit radiation. It enforced the expected result of a traceable exposure on objects the system accepted as measurement evidence. Investigators described the reference exposure chain of acceptance more confidently than the phenomenon's origin. After the silent dose, the institution changed procedure. National calibration certificates from the incident period were withdrawn. Thousands of dosimeters were rechecked against physical sources. The reference exposure correction reduced immediate risk while removing a capability operators had begun to depend on. The corrective action after reference exposure was tested against normal operation before staff accepted the lost capability. For reference exposure, the original medium and one independently derived comparison were retained under separate custody. One trace of reference exposure remained after closure. A new employee badge arrived from the printer already carrying a 0.4 millisievert entry and a PS4 calibration mark. The remaining trace from the silent dose has not been reconciled with the official finding. Residual evidence from the silent dose was photographed and sealed after the main systems were removed from service. In the silent dose, an independent review reproduced the result documented under residual evidence without using the operational interface. Current procedure at National Radiological Monitoring Center, Calibration Laboratory, reflects the unresolved status of the silent dose. The center now separates instrument identity from calibration status and keeps passive controls outside all electronic and paper registers. For reference exposure, the purpose is to preserve raw disagreement before automation turns it into consensus. The revised reference exposure procedure requires disagreement to remain visible until a human review documents a choice. The silent dose file preserves both the expected baseline and the anomalous current procedure value, separating absence from disagreement. The final reference exposure record states, no source was missing. No radiation was detected. The dose was real only where someone intended to measure it. The case documented as the silent dose is closed for operation and remains open for measurement.